so sorry for the delay. Welcome. We're very, very happy today to be hosting David Fell of SOAS, University of London, where he is Professor of Comparative Politics and Director of the Taiwan Studies Center. Throughout his career, David has established himself as probably the preeminent expert, certainly in the UK, and among the very top in the wider world on the politics of Taiwan in general, and in particular on party politics. He's written multiple books on this, edited several books, a whole series of articles about party politics, public opinion, elections, many different dimensions of politics in Taiwan. And so it's particularly apropos after what to me were fairly surprising local elections in Taiwan very recently, that we should welcome him today to discuss, in part at least, his new book about Taiwan's Green Party and the various kinds of alternative party politics that exist in perhaps the most vibrant democracy in Asia. So thank you very much, and please welcome Professor David Fell.
Thanks, Bill. So it's great to be back speaking at Cambridge. It's actually my first time here since 2007, when I just become a lecturer. And today's topic is about something a little bit different from what we often look at when we study Taiwan's politics. We tend to focus heavily on the two big parties, cross-strait relations, but to me this is quite a fun topic that I've been involved in for just over 10 years now. So, the research project is a team one that I'm working with 3 Taiwanese academics, and the thing that kind of the commonality of my 3 colleagues is they're all former Green Party leaders, and they're all former Green Party candidates, and all 3 of them also have experience in the Green Party's international diplomacy, which is the theme of today's talk. Most of the talks that I've done on the book have been much more electoral focused, but I thought because this is the geopolitics centre, I would kind of adjust the focus a little bit. So we have Peng Yewen, Wang Yanhan, and the third one is Zhang Zhuqin on the far right. Gao Chengyan, who's towards the middle, he's one of the party founders, and he'll feature a fair bit in today's talk. So what we are trying to do in this part of the project is try to build on my 2021 book. So currently the 4 of us are working on a Chinese version of the book. And there were a few areas that we wanted to further develop, and one of them was about the Green Party's diplomacy. I do talk a little bit about it in the book, but we felt it needed a bit more attention, as well as some of the other areas. So what we're trying to do in this will be a chapter in the book, is try and tell the story of the history of Taiwan's Green Party's international engagement. And here it's plural rather than singular, because there's been more than one Green Party in Taiwan. So here we have an example of the Trees Party, who were over in the UK for the 2017 Global Greens Congress, which was held in Liverpool. And in April of 2017, we hosted both officially registered Taiwanese Green Parties at SOAS. We had the official Green Party in the morning and the Trees Party in the afternoon. A little bit of context, if any of you are not kind of Taiwan specialists. Taiwan's party system is a little bit different from a lot of newer democracies because it has such a stable party system. A lot of new democracies, you see very, very chaotic party systems. If you think about Japan, but Japan's not so new, Japan or Korea. But Taiwan, you have that dominance of these 2 actors. The Democratic Progressive Party on the left, and the Kuomintang, the KMT, on the right. So this picture is from my first year in Taiwan as an undergraduate student in 1989, which was a kind of a semi-democratic election. But throughout this last 3 decades, it's really been these two parties that dominate. If we look at the most recent election, again, it's really these two that are winning almost all the seats. And until relatively recently, the small parties in the party system were splinter parties. In other words, they were parties that split away from these two. So different versions of these two parties. Basically the same ideology and the same personnel, just splitting away and sometimes returning. In contrast, the Green Party Taiwan is what we call a movement party. So it's a party that was created by social movement activists. And the party was created in 1996 and roughly goes through these 4 phases. So initial promising phase, a quiet phase, this is electorally, a period of returning to elections, 2006 to 2012, and becoming competitive or semi-competitive after 2013. Okay, so one question that I'm often challenged on is why spend a decade looking at a party that often seems like it's on the margins of Taiwan's party system? Bill just mentioned the local elections, and the local elections were actually a disaster for the party. And my wife did say to me again, maybe you should drop this project, but I'm not ready to do that yet because I enjoy this project so much. My students over the last 10 years have endlessly heard me talking about it. So it's by far the oldest of the still existing movement parties in Taiwan. There are some others, but they're not electorally active. And in many ways, the Taiwan Green Party has been a pioneer on a lot of issues that today we kind of take for granted in Taiwan as mainstream positions. For example, it's the first party to talk openly about things like LGBT rights and same-sex marriage. The first party to have openly LGBT candidates. It's the first party to have a female party leader. And throughout its history, it's put a lot of stress, as we would expect, on environmental issues, particularly opposition to nuclear power. One of the most salient environmental issues, which was to a certain extent only really resolved last year with the referendum against the 4th nuclear power station. It's also by far the most international of Taiwan's political parties, and that's what I'll particularly focus on today. So here we have a picture from the 2015 Asia Pacific Greens Congress that was held in New Zealand. And we have party leaders, party candidates, and just through this picture we get a sense of the kind of issue focus of this party. We have a key environmental leader as well as a key figure in Taiwan's LGBT rights movement. Okay, now one of the ways that in this chapter we try to kind of link the Green Party to the kind of literature on Taiwan's diplomacy is to kind of build on some of Gary Rawnsley's arguments about the importance of civil society diplomacy in Taiwan. He argues that often Taiwanese civil society is able to reach places that state-led diplomacy really struggles to get at. And this was something that one of my master's students did some really interesting work on. What she looked at was Taiwan's LGBT rights diplomacy and looked at how it was, again, able to go to places, for example, UN meetings, EU-organised conferences that the Taiwanese state was often excluded from. She also showed how the legalization of same-sex marriage was able to get far more international media attention than state-led public diplomacy programs. And she focused on the international media response to the Constitutional Court ruling on same-sex marriage in 2010. 2017. Another kind of angle that crossed my mind when I was preparing today's talk was something that was in the news in the last week or so, and that's railway diplomacy, where there's been a really exciting set of exchanges between UK and Taiwanese railway enthusiasts and organisations. So in the news last week was an exchange of trains between Alishan and the Welshpool Railway. So again, it seems to be this kind of civil society-led bottom-up diplomacy seems to be quite effective. And a key player in this is Michael Riley, who was a former UK representative to Taiwan, but then has tried to kind of develop this kind of civil society railway diplomacy. But what about the Taiwan Green Party diplomacy? Why is that particularly interesting? Taiwan's major parties that I mentioned earlier, the KMT and the DP, they're all part of international party networks. So the KMT is part of the same association as the British Conservative Party. The DP is part of the same association as the Liberal Democrats in the UK. And of course, the Green Party Taiwan is a part of Global Greens. But if we look at these comparatively, the Taiwan Greens are much more involved within these kind of international networks. Often in our interviews, this was the part of Green Party involvement that was most meaningful. While in comparison, electoral politics was often very, very frustrating. And here we have an example of the way that Taiwan is able to engage internationally. This is Katie Yen, who was actually at the first focus groups that I did back in December of 2012 as an ordinary party member who was doing the party's international exchanges. She then goes on to be the convener of the Asia Pacific Greens Network. And then in 2017, she becomes the convener of Global Greens. So you have a Taiwanese party member taking the leading role for all the Green parties in the world. And she just stepped down, I think, in 2021. Okay, now one challenge when we're looking at this topic of assessing the impact of this kind of green diplomacy is how do we actually do this? What kind of, how do we actually, and we were just talking about this yesterday with one of my PhD students at SOAS, Adrian, who looks at party-to-party relations between Hong Kong and Taiwan parties. And in the paper we propose a number of ways that we can do this. One of them is just, can you actually take part in these international party organizations? Because of course Taiwan is so isolated in most international organizations. And a follow-up way we can look at this is the quality of participation. In other words, whether they take leadership roles, whether pro-Taiwan resolutions are passed, the hosting of Green Party events, the degree that we have both incoming and outgoing delegations, whether or not this kind of diplomacy actually enhances Taiwan's international visibility or policies on Taiwan. And a further way we can think about this is the actual effect of this diplomacy on Taiwan domestically. For example, does this actually enhance the electoral fortunes of the party? Does this change the political identities of the activists that are involved in these kind of exchanges? So there's a number of ways we can try to look at the impact. Okay, so in many ways this kind of green diplomacy starts almost immediately as soon as the party is established. So the party is established as a result of a group of 3 student environmental activists. They're in a pub in Taipei City and come up with the idea about this party. And then they go around trying to persuade NGO leaders to sign up to this idea. And the party is officially established between these students and social movement activists from a number of NGO groups in late January of 1996, just in time for their first election in March of 1996. So it's about 6 weeks old when it has its first election. And those of you that follow Taiwanese politics will know that 1996 was a special year. The first direct presidential election, but also it's the time of the cross-strait missile crisis, where we have Chinese military tests that are designed to influence Taiwan's first presidential election. So it's a time of real tension, a little bit like the tensions that we saw in August of this year, following the Nancy Pelosi visits to Taiwan. Now, generally, environmental parties are put at a disadvantage when the focus is on China and not more kind of social issues. But the Green Party was able to get really significant media attention because the leader, who is Gao Chengyan, who we saw in the third slide, goes out with some foreign correspondents into the Chinese missile zone to protest against Chinese missiles and show that his party is taking a tough line towards these threats. This action gives the party both domestic media attention but also international media attention. So a lot of the British papers covered this story. So this meant that suddenly the international Green parties became aware that there was a new Green Party in Taiwan. There hadn't been any communication before that. So very quickly, the European Greens Federation releases a statement in support of Taiwan's struggle for self-determination and calling on China to cease their military actions. So this was quite significant for the party, getting this immediate international recognition. And they follow up by agreeing to send a couple of people from Europe to Taiwan in time for this election. One of them drops out because of fear of the degree of tension between Taiwan and China. But the one that does go is Penny Kemp, who we see pictured here, who was at this point an important England and Wales Green Party figure. So she's in Taiwan for a couple of weeks during and right after the campaign. And she has a really big impact on the young activists that she talks to. She gives them a clearer sense of what it means to be a Green Party. And the England and Wales Green Party news letter had the slogan, Penny helps Taiwan Greens win a seat. So at this stage, the England and Wales Green Party had not yet won a seat in our national parliament. That was still, how many years? About 15 years off. But Taiwan's Green Party managed to win a seat when it's only 6 weeks old. So it's quite an achievement. And following this, we have the first Green Party delegation going to the UK. Penny Kemp helped set this up in the summer of 1996. And she also helps set up linkages between the Taiwan Green Party and other Green parties. For example, in the summer of 1996, Bob Brown of the Australian Green Party visits Taiwan, and they start discussions about setting up an Asia-Pacific Green Parties network. In 2000, Penny Kemp also helps arrange a Green Party visit to Europe, in which they actually have a press conference that's hosted by the European Greens in the European Parliament. So it's the first time that a Taiwanese party has had a press conference like this in the European Parliament. Now, another way that we can see this kind of international nature of the party is some of the party leaders. So we have a number of non-Taiwan-born party leaders. One of them is Linda Arrigo, who we see on the far left here, who's was quite an important dissident in Taiwan's democratization movement. So she becomes the party's international officer in 1997. and again is able to kind of build on some of these initial linkages. So we start to get European green delegations coming to Taiwan. So here we have Franz Floss, who was the spokesperson of the European Greens. And they were coming on a range of issues. For example, we have German Greens coming on the theme of better protection for stray dogs. So that's the kind of alternative thing that the Greens do. Another area that we start to see exchange is with other Asian green groups. So the first, Taiwan is the first Asian Green Party, and we start to see Japan and South Korea building up not exactly full parties, but they're moving in that party direction. So in 1997, we have collaboration between the Taiwan Greens and environmental groups from South Korea. And in this case, their focus was a plan by the Taiwan Power Company, who runs the nuclear power stations in Taiwan, to export nuclear waste to North Korea. We have joint demonstrations in Taipei between the Green Party and these Korean delegations. The state reacts very angrily in Taiwan. So a KMT-friendly party physically tries to beat up these protesters, and the Korean Greens get deported. But they are successful in this project is shelved. Now, another way that we can see this impact is through the establishment of international green organizations. So discussions about the Asia-Pacific Greens Federation start in 1996 between Australian, New Zealand and Taiwanese activists. And the Taiwanese again joined the preparatory meeting in 2000 in Australia. And this association, so it's following on from first we have the European Greens, followed by, I think, American, and then the Asia-Pacific Greens. So it is formally established in 2001. And again, Taiwan takes a leading role in this organization with Gao Chengyan, one of the 3 global green coordinators. And I think what's also quite interesting here is that this is all occurring at a time when electorally the party is just about stopped. So the party basically stops joining elections from 1999 through to 2006. But during this electorally dormant period, the party is very, very active in international exchanges. For example, they take an active part in the first Asia-Pacific Greens Congress, which is held in Japan in 2005. And one of the things that they put a lot of stress on is these Congress resolutions, and using these to put pressure to give Taiwan more visibility, but also to put pressure on Taiwan's government. Because, Taiwan's government cares a lot about its international reputation. So we had resolutions not only on the issue of the China threat, but also about potentially polluting industrial projects, such as here it's called the 8th Oil Refinery Project plant, which at this point in time actually has support by the DUP government and will later become a very controversial petrochemical project that eventually is shelved in 2011. We see a similar pattern in 2008 when the Global Greens Congress is held in Brazil. And reports on this show that Taiwan is a very, very active player in the Congress. And it also has one of the largest delegations. So they're able to kind of, even though electorally at this point they're still quite small. I think they got 0.7% of the vote in 2008. But among Green parties, they're very active. For example, they have the largest global Young Greens delegation in this Congress. And they play a key part on the resolution on nuclear power, the resolution that was passed stating that nuclear power is not a solution for the climate crisis. And here we have one of the very influential figures in Taiwan's green diplomacy, the environmental lawyer Robin Winkler. And I think this statement that he made to the press, I think, reflects the Green Party's approach to diplomacy. So he argues that the success of Taiwan's international future doesn't lie in that kind of formal diplomatic relations, which government puts so much stress on. Instead, it's human rights and environmental diplomacy. And here we have another of the Green Party figures who's very, very active in pushing Taiwan's green diplomacy. It's Pan Heng-seng. And he, in the Taipei Times, he describes these global green congresses as being the UN for green organizations. And he explains that under the oppression from China and control from the US, Taiwan's space for survival in the international community is very limited. However, he notes that we're able to attend the conference with full membership, a status that even China did not enjoy. So from his perspective, the Greens is an area where, one of these few areas where Taiwan has an advantage over China. Early on in the presentation, I mentioned the fact that there are two Green parties in 2017, and he does later split off to become the founder of the Trees Party. So this is from one of his, I think 2014, maybe 2014 or 2018 campaigns. Okay. Now, as a result of this repeated participation, a number of these figures, such as Pan, Robin Winkler, and others, became quite skilled at doing this kind of diplomacy. And here we have a quote from one of the Green Party leaders, who's actually also the first openly LGBT candidate, Wang Zhongming. And he talks about his experience at the 2012 Global Greens Congress in Dakar. And this is what he said. That year we went to West Africa. We were really doing diplomacy. You need to have allies and know who you're opposing. I tried to ally with the weaker Green parties, to stand up to the European parties. He really disliked the European Green Party. He was saying that they wore suits. And this is something that Green Party shouldn't do. In those days, we went to these events with a goal. So he, Robin Winkler, and Pan Heng-seng would spend a lot of time planning what they were going to do, what kind of resolutions would they pass. Heng-seng wanted to be able to create a Japan-Korea alliance and wanted to create an international impression of us. And the big Green parties, particularly the European parties, were often afraid of us, according to Wang. And we see this continue into 2015 with the next Asia Pacific Greens Congress. And here we've got one of the resolutions there on Taiwan's self-determination. So we can see how, again, they're trying to push Taiwan's international space, stress that threat of China against Taiwan in that international community. So in some ways, these goals are overlapping with those of the Taiwanese state. So the most recent Global Green Congress was 2017 in Liverpool. The latest one has been delayed for a couple of years because of COVID. But I think this most recent Congress really, again, shows the high degree of involvement. And in fact, in this Congress, Taiwan has two large delegations for the Green Party and the Trees Party. Although some participants did question, why do you need two Green parties? Is that kind of, does that suggest a divided environmental movement? Another element that we consider as important in terms of Taiwan's green diplomacy is hosting major green events. And the major one that Taiwan has hosted was the 2010 Asia-Pacific Greens Congress. And this clearly did have a pretty significant impact on the Green Party itself within Taiwan. Following this, they have their best local election campaigns, the equivalent of what we had last weekend for mayoral and council elections. So it really gives them a big boost. But it also has a boost in terms of personnel and bringing in people who will stay with the party for the next few years. So, for example, Wang Zhongming, who we just had quoted in the previous slide, became active during this Congress. Wang Yanhan, who becomes party leader and candidate and is working with me on this project, also joins as a volunteer in this Congress, as well as Kelly Yen, who goes on to be the Asia-Pacific Greens convener and the Global Greens convener. Again, this is her first involvement in a Green Party event. So you can see how it kind of brings in human resources. Another element of this kind of diplomacy is bilateral party relations. So we've talked about this European Greens visit, but Taiwan has also been quite heavily involved in supporting newer Green parties in Asia. For example, it's worked together closely with the Japanese and Korean Greens, who were established much later, and playing a key part in terms of sharing their experience of diplomacy, but also of electoral politics. Another area that I particularly wanted to add, because my student is here, who's looking at Taiwan-Hong Kong party relations, was to add the example of Taiwan Green Party's relations with parties in Hong Kong. And here we have a Green Party delegation going to Hong Kong just on the handover. So I think it was like the week before the handover to Chinese rule. And I think they met the Democratic Party, but they also wanted to kind of put pressure on the outgoing British government. And here we have the slogan, "One Taiwan, One China." And I think that also gives you a sense of their position on the unification independence issue. So the Green Party was not only talking to other Green parties, it was also talking to other parties that were ideologically close to them. And in Adrian's PhD, he talks about the relationship between the Taiwan Greens and the Labour Party in Hong Kong. And I managed to get find a photograph of this this meeting. So here we have the Green Party leader and the Hong Kong Labour Party leader. So this, because at this point in time, the Taiwan Greens were in alliance with local union groups. So there was a good connection. One area that I think we would like to try and find a bit of evidence for, but it's going to take a bit of research, is to see if we can find any connection between this Green Party diplomacy and government positions of overseas countries, particularly those that have Green parties in government. When I did this talk, a short version of this talk in Cyprus, a couple of the German people in the audience felt that there was potential here, but this is something that I've not really got firm data on, but I think it has potential. And we can see this, for example, with the Luxembourg Greens, who came to Taiwan in May of 2010. And then they also issue a statement on Taiwan's entry to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So there is, again, I think there's potential here. Okay, sorry. Another area where you can see the impact on Taiwan, externally into Taiwan, is the way that the Green Party is heavily influenced by international Green Party ideology. So one of the things that came up a lot in fieldwork is the way that they try to translate these kind of key elements of the Global Greens Charter into Taiwanese electoral discourse. One kind of issue where we do see this linkage that is often quite challenging is on the issue of the death penalty. And internationally, Green parties tend to oppose the death penalty, but Taiwanese public opinion is very supportive of the death penalty. So it's when we touched upon this in an event yesterday, and someone said maybe it's something like 85% oppose lifting the death penalty in Taiwan. But I think the Green Party has tried to kind of stick to that position, even though it's often been quite heavily attacked domestically. For example, in 2012, there was a Facebook campaign against the Taiwan Green Party because of its advocacy against the death penalty. I think another way we can see this impact is the way that participation in green diplomacy affects the identities of activists, even after they leave the party. Because, of course, many of these activists don't stay in the party too long, but they'll go into other areas, other social movements, or even other political parties. So many of the figures that we've interviewed over this decade have actually switched parties. Some of them have gone into, for example, the DPP. So for example, the reason I first started this project was an email from one of my students who happened to be a Green Party candidate 2 months after she graduated. So she stood for National Parliament. And later, she goes on to get poached by the ruling party, the DPP. But she still kind of tries to kind of stay with her kind of green values. Okay, what about the most recent trends? Because Bill mentioned the last local election. I think overall, what we see is lower levels of international engagement by the Green Party in the last few years. I think one of the major reasons for that is due to human resources. In other words, some of the most skilled figures in green diplomacy have moved away from the party. For example, I mentioned Pan Sheng went on to create the Trees Party. Wang Zhongming was jailed for some of his environmental activism. I can't remember. Maybe he didn't pay his fines. And then drifts away from the party. Robin Winkler also drifts away. And Kelly Yen, once she becomes the global Greens convener, she relocates to Europe. So we see a lot of these kind of key figures. And this was how one of the, I think Wang Zhongming talked about the way that Green Party diplomacy was being done after he left. So he argues that the current Green Party doesn't have the ability to do that kind of diplomacy. They don't know what they're doing. They have no idea why they're going to meetings. It's more like a tour group. And again, we touched upon that yesterday. Of course, the more recent figures would feel quite annoyed by that comment, and I think it's quite possible that I have to take that out in the Chinese version of the book, because that's been one of the funny things about working with co-authors. As a single author, there's things that I've written, and I haven't worried about upsetting people or kind of losing friends, but for my co-authors, that's been more of an issue. However, despite these relatively lower level of participation, I think even if we look at the some of the most recent developments, I mentioned the Nancy Pelosi visit and those cross-strait tensions following that in August of 2022. We can see how the Asia-Pacific Greens did try to respond. I'm not sure if this was prompted by the Taiwan Greens, maybe not. but they did have a statement on these Chinese threats, with a statement: China should accept Taiwan as a sovereign nation, and a kind of detailed statement was issued by the party, and the party has continued to work in some of the subgroups. For example, the Taiwan's participation is still quite strong in the Young Asia Pacific Greens, or the Asia Pacific Women's Network. Okay, so overall, then, what we're trying to do in this chapter is to kind of tell the story of the history of Taiwan's Green Party's diplomacy, how it starts, the way it evolves, and to try and look at some of the ways we can think about the impact. By looking at party diplomacy, we try to bring a kind of different angle on Taiwan's party politics, as well as Taiwan's international relations. And I think based on our research, I think it shows that this is a realm where Taiwan, I think, can actually play an important role. It's probably underplaying that role over the last few years, but it really has a potential if we think about how isolated Taiwan is internationally. And that's where I'm going to finish.
So that was a really interesting talk, really fruitful presentation, and I learned a great deal about the Green Party. I was actually a student in Taiwan in 1995 and 1996, and I remember, now that you mention it, the incident of the Green Party leader Gao Chengyan, right, who went into the missile test zone. I remember that being on television at the time. I had forgotten it in the intervening years until you brought it up. So it was interesting to be reminded of that. And the whole time I was kind of thinking in the back of my mind of a couple of questions. One is this story of the Green Party coming out of social movements and sort of slowly gaining a foothold in the electoral arena, but never really taking off in terms of winning lots of seats or winning a large share of the vote, but starting to win over a lot of civil society and starting to push mainstream parties a bit further in their direction, and then eventually sort of getting representation, actually quite quickly, getting some representation in parliament and so on. Isn't that kind of typical of Green Parties everywhere? I mean, is that really distinct from, say, the German Green Party or other European Green Parties in other countries in Asia, even in North America where Green Parties exist, which they do, although they're even smaller than in these other contexts. And then the second question was, is there something distinctively Taiwanese about the way that the Taiwan Green Party has engaged in this kind of party diplomacy, right? And I remember this also in the sense of the Democratic Progressive Party, before it came into power, was also very good at this. Used to convene something, if I remember correctly, called the Council of Asian Liberals and Democrats, right, to try to bring together anti-authoritarian parties from other parts of Asia to Taiwan to kind of gain some foothold in this international arena. Even though it was not in power, it wasn't even really yet a serious contender for power when it started with some of these initiatives, right? But it was quite successful at gaining a global footprint and global foothold, even as it was just getting off the ground domestically, and in a way that Taiwan as a government couldn't do, right? So this sort of small opposition party at the time managed to do that. The Green Party sounds like it's kind of done the same thing. Maybe even the Tree Party has too, even as it's splintered further. So first of all, I guess, is there something distinct about the Green Party and its genesis and roots and the way that it's sort of come to be? And then the second thing is there something distinctively Taiwanese about its diplomacy initiative and international engagement?
Fantastic. Yeah, really nice nice question. So we were living in Taiwan at the same time. I was I was living there in Kaohsiung, 95 to 6. Okay, I mean, one of the things that struck us when we were looking at the nature of Green Party activists and Green Party supporters, Green Party members was how similar they were, that kind of demographic profile, to those of European Green Party supporters. They tended to be better educated, urban-based, experience of protest, very open-minded culturally. So I think there are a lot of similarities. I think when I've done the talk, the Taiwan Green Party's talked with local Green Parties here, they recognise themselves, and they recognise the arguments. Because one of the things that comes through in the book a lot is fighting, the inability to kind of reach consensus and agreement on things. So I think there's definitely a lot of similarity. A lot of European Green Parties were born out of the struggle against nuclear power, nuclear weapons. So again, there's a big commonality there. But I think with the diplomacy side, a key element is Taiwan's international isolation. That's such a big thing, such a sense of frustration within Taiwanese society. So I think that's one of the reasons why there's greater pressure on Taiwanese parties to engage internationally. And I think that's in my class this morning, we were talking about LGBT rights in Taiwan, and why Taiwan's government has been at times willing to go against public opinion to push through, let's say, same-sex marriage. And I think one of the key reasons is the desire to get greater international recognition. So I remember in the class I did with Sohan, one of the students did a really nice paper comparing Taiwan and Japan. And despite the fact that Japan looked like it should be the candidate to go first, as more tolerant public opinion, older democracy, but he argued the difference was that desire for international recognition that you don't have in Japan. So I think that's one of the things that I think makes both Taiwan's parties, but also Taiwan as a whole, a bit different from a lot of other Asian cases.
Great. Are there any questions from anyone in the audience? Yes.
Actually, I gained a lot of knowledge from your lecture. I used to think the issues like LGBT rights and environment protection are concerns of the DPP, and your lecture told me they are the issues that the Green Party concerns. So I have two questions for you. The first one is about what's your definition of diplomacy? So are these activities of the Taiwan Green Party a kind of diplomacy or just international exchanges? Well, to what extent can this Green Party diplomacy influence Taiwan government or represent Taiwan government in the international arena? So I think that the fact that there is such room for the Taiwan's international involvement in this arena indicates that these issues of interest to the Green Party are issues that have very limited political influence, and they are low politics issues. So if they are high politics issues or issues in the traditional diplomacy arena, why the Chinese government has not attempted to prevent these political participation in the international arena? My second question is that how important or influential is this diplomacy in the context of growing international tensions and the renewed dominance of traditional security issues in many international interactions? Since my research concerns nationalism in China, and I found that there's rising Chinese nationalist appeals for its government to attack Taiwan. So would this kind of Green Party diplomacy help Taiwan to gain more international support when China attacks Taiwan? Thank you.
Yeah, great. I think there's, even though you said it was two questions, I think there was a lot of things packed in there. I think when the DP is established in 1986, one of its founding principles is opposition to nuclear power. But over time, civil society starts to question how sincere they were on that issue, but as well as a number of other civil society issues. So that was one of the reasons why civil society groups wanted to break away and have a bit of autonomy. And on the LGBT rights one, definitely it's these movement parties that move first on that. But one of the ways we can kind of measure movement parties' success or impact is the way that they influence these mainstream parties. And we saw that in 2016, when suddenly the DUP tries to steal not just that issue, but other social movement issues. So that, even though that may undermine the impact of the Green Party, it's a mark of success. They were really shocked. How come they're suddenly coming out openly, a presidential candidate coming openly for same-sex marriage? So that was, and I think even the KMT has adjusted position over time, and particularly since legalization in 2019. The second part of the first question, can this kind of diplomacy, does it really matter? I guess when Taiwan is so isolated internationally, any kind of formal participation, I think from a Taiwanese angle, is a positive thing, because you're so used to being excluded, or having to use what Taiwanese will find as very kind of embarrassing names to join. One of the parts of the question was about whether these groups are representing Taiwanese government. Sometimes yes and sometimes no. Sometimes they're trying to use these international platforms actually to attack the Taiwanese government, particularly when it's doing things that are environmentally damaging. And that's why they try and embarrass the Taiwan government on things like the petrochemical industry. And at other times, the positions are overlapping, particularly regarding the threat from China, or the kind of the call for international recognition. Whether or not these will help in the advent of a Chinese attack, I think it's difficult for us to be sure on that point. But clearly, I think what Taiwan wants is greater international sympathy and recognition. Whether that translates into support, military support, I think is something that it's hard for me to kind of stretch it there. But at times, I think Taiwan's government is quite happy to see this kind of exchange, even though sometimes it's embarrassing, because they will expose elements of Taiwan, for example, on the death penalty. That maybe
the nuclear waste.
Oh, the nuclear waste one. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right. We saw that with the export of, I think it was poisonous waste from to Cambodia. Again, this was exposed by people like Linda Arrigo. So I think it's a mixed picture there.
Great. Other questions? Yes.
Well, first of all, thanks a lot for a really interesting lecture. I also learned a lot, because I did not know very much at all or anything at all about Taiwanese Green Parties before that. So, Mike, I have two fairly simple questions, and then one that's a little bit more complicated. The simple ones are just based on some of the things that you mentioned in the speech. I'd like to know a little bit more about. Why was it that the Green Party did not participate in the elections for the brief period? I can't remember the exact date range, but you mentioned there was like a kind of quiet period. So what was the rationale there? And second is, why does Taiwan need two Green Parties? Which I was really interested in knowing more about that. And then a little bit more from a research perspective, so my research also sort of looks at smaller political parties that didn't quite win elections. And I was just curious if you could talk a little bit about how you think about approaching assessing and doing research on these types of organizations that have international presence and kind of find a life outside of the bounds of national politics, and how do you do research on something like that? Like you said, you get challenged all the time as to what's the relevance here. So I would be interested in how you sort of think about studying political parties in that context.
Fantastic. Yeah, really nice, nice questions. One of my, I love every chapter in the book, but one of the chapters I really love is the chapter about the quiet period. And I try to look at why this happened, a couple of disastrous campaigns during that period, and then how they start to revive, including which Indian restaurant did they take people to that they wanted to persuade people to kind of get back involved again. I think there are a number of factors in the kind of the start of that quiet period. One of them was the change of ruling parties in 2000, and suddenly you have a pro-civil society party in power, and that party starts to try to poach people. So one of the key anti-nuclear figures becomes the environmental minister. So it becomes harder to oppose that party. Another factor a linked factor was human resources. Certain key activists had reached the stage that they needed to go abroad to do their PhDs. The party founder says, 1, 2, 3, they all said, I'm going abroad to do my PhD. And just a few key people disappearing had a big impact. Another one was financial resources, losing their deposits when they had a bad election, and running out of money. There was a rumor that one of the leaders had to sell his house to carry on the party, and that he's afraid to go home because of what his wife would say to him.
What home could he go back to?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah, good point. You wouldn't mind me selling the house to support Taiwan Greens, would you? Yeah. Because money matters, and Taiwanese election campaigns are expensive. The deposit, the campaign. There are a couple of things that really affected that quiet period, and then they try to restart, partly because some of these figures finished their PhDs. So, for example, Gao, the catching missiles guy, goes to the US and goes to see one of the activists who's finishing her PhD and says, "You've got to come back, save the party." And she listens to him, and as soon as she submits her thesis, she comes back and starts getting things going. Goes to the 2005 Congress. So people really matter, but you've got to have the right type of people, and maybe that's one of the problems with the party at the moment. The second question is about party splits, which it's actually quite common for Green parties to split. It happens in other countries as well, and usually it's not it's a clash of personalities. The party leader tried to be too centralizing and wasn't willing to accept diversity within the party. He wanted to try a different style of operation, and that led to a clash between him and the big party star. And there were a couple of other charismatic figures that left at that point in time. One respondent said that Lee was trying to make the party more like a religious group than a inclusive political party. Although the Trees Party doesn't make it in the end, it stands for 3 elections, but eventually it's dissolved because it didn't have anyone to do the admin stuff, the filing the annual financial reports, which is actually really important. I mean, I think if, as someone who's organises academic events, you know that those kind of things matter. If those things are missing, if there's a signature or a code missing on the plane ticket, and the university bureaucracy is never going to pay that. It'll get lost in, and it'll be discovered 4 years later. But so that was the issue there for the split. It was really sad. I know a lot of people were so upset, and I was. One of the problems with studying Green parties is very different from mainstream parties. Is I find it harder to be neutral, and that's why in the final chapter I do give suggestions, which I wouldn't do with a mainstream party. And that was probably why I decided to study this party, because I was so moved by the idealism and the anger in those early focus groups. The way that something quite small could become something that would make people shout at each other, which I hadn't seen before. The third question is one that's really important. And when we study, even in the classroom, we often talk about, when we study political parties, which ones do we include and which ones do we exclude? Which of those... when I was writing the book, there were about 300 parties in Taiwan. Now there's about 70 because of the new parties law. And there's different ways we can decide which ones matter, and different standards we can take. Sometimes if you just look at who's running a strong campaign, who's actually buying ads, but that varies. And sometimes it can be quite deceptive. So, for example, in 2016, there was a party called the Mingguodang, the MKT, and they had a lot of money, and they also had a kind of a North Korea style anthem and ads, and they became the third largest party in terms of membership in that campaign, maybe the fifth in terms of campaign spending, but within 2 years they'd disappeared, and nothing was left. So it's a really difficult decision. It really depends on the standards that we take. And because I've published quite a few things on small parties in Taiwan, and each time I'll use a different set of standards.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about the party splitting that way. One's reminded almost of sort of Life of Brian, and the rebels sitting around and splitting off into groups of 1 or 2. Yes, Brendan.
Thank you very much. An observation, a question. The observations to do with splits. Brendan Behan, I'm from Ireland. Brendan Behan, one of our famous playwrights, once quipped that the first item on the agenda in any Irish party is the split. But the question is to do with something you alluded to just now, which was your own sort of standpoint in this research, because it does seem to me it is a bit unusual in the sense that you're obviously yourself engaged in the material, and I think that gives you a lot of energy and a lot of access and motivation, but presumably also throws up some questions around approach and bias and other things. How have your reviewers dealt with that, and how do you try to mitigate against possible accusations of bias?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's been raised a few times. But I think in the core analysis of the book, I try and be as balanced as I can. So in other words, I've got to talk to people from different factions, and even small parties are often very, very factionalized. So I've got to bring in those different perspectives, and then reach a conclusion about who's right. And at times, that's been difficult for readers. And I know that when the Chinese version comes out, don't think too many activists have actually read the English version. And those that have, who are working with me, have been quite unhappy with a lot of my... the fact that I have brought in such diverse angles, and I had to do that. I think I'm quite fair and balanced in the conclusions, but that took a lot of interviews and follow-up interviews. I'm quite comfortable with the core part. I mean, I have suggestions about what I think the party should do in the final chapter, but again, they're all very based on evidence. So basically, I try and link those recommendations with what's happened. And the lecture that I did, the last few lectures that I've done on this book have been on the question of lessons of defeat. And it was motivated by one of my co-authors' comment about why do we keep making the same mistakes? That one of the features of the Green Party in Taiwan is that most people only stand once. Things go wrong, and then they leave. And then the party makes a similar mistake. There are a few people who do stick around, but I think it's an important question. I think it's going to be really interesting to see how we deal with that in the Chinese version. And I guess one way we get around that is because the three co-authors are from different periods, and I can feel that they disagree on things. And fortunately, we've got enough people that basically, when we've been going through some of the draft chapters, we're often arguing about every sentence, but we have to kind of reach some kind of joint decision. Let me just come back to the initial point on, the splits one, and and the Life of Brian one. That has come up. I have had quite a few people posting that clip of that video on when I've been doing Facebook posts. That has come up multiple times, particularly whenever I mention the Trees Party.
Is there a twig party that then splits off from the trees party?
I mean, with the party's closure, I've been watching to see where they go. So one went to the DPP, one went to work for the independent mayor of Taipei's party, which is now the third largest party, and one went to the New Power Party. I mean, one of the things I argue in the final chapter is that the party really needs to bring these people back, to kind of bring back that rich experience. But there's been a bit of resistance to that idea of, and I am finally going back to Taiwan after 3 years, and hopefully I'm going to get to talk about some of these proposals. In fact, the initial idea of the project that my student asked me to do was to come up with some suggestions in 2012, to do a bit of research and then say what the party should do. And finally I'm going to come back and have a try at that.
Yes.
I'm interested, you mentioned that they sort of have some sort of like join up with the Hong Kong Labour Party, and that seemed to be quite long ago. I just wonder whether, especially in the light of the kind of increasingly difficult situation of Hong Kong, whether they had any more kind of like closer association, and whether that's drawn the criticism of China.
Yes. I mean, my impression is that that was quite a time-limited collaboration. So at that point in time, the Taiwan Green Party was working with labour groups, labour unions in Taiwan. So there was that commonality there. The person who set up that visit did his PhD on trade unionism in Hong Kong and Taiwan when he was at Essex. So there was that connection there. So he'd studied those people, who then went on to create the Labour Party. So my impression, Adrian, do you want to respond on this question?
Yeah, I think even after 2016, the Green Party was becoming quite close to the DPP as well. So I guess that lost, the Labour Party in Hong Kong lost interest to interact with them because they want to kind of learn the left-wing policy. But because they are so close with the DPP, they didn't have that basis to interact with them. So I guess in 2013, that was the kind of only time that the two parties interact twice on that year. But I guess after that, they didn't really interact between the Green Party and the Labour Party. So yeah, that was the only time.
And within the parties, often a divide, particularly in recent years, between should we focus on social movements or should we focus more on just winning elections? And the after 2016 or maybe 2017, it's the election first faction that's dominant, and they're quite critical of a number of social movement groups. So they one of their key figures makes fun of failures of trade unions in Taiwan, and that really alienates the union activists, as it does some of the. So in that period, it's almost like the party is selling its soul, and that makes cooperation even less possible with those Hong Kong parties. But I guess also you have a lot of change in Hong Kong party system as well. It's much more unstable. I don't know whether was the Labour Party still existing.
It does. But you mean after the 2020?
Yes.
Getting more difficult. But before that, because they also lost it in the 2016 election, the Labour Party, so they didn't have. I think they only have one member in the Legislative Council, so that also makes it more difficult.
No, I think the Labour Party, or the one that's called the democratically inclined one, called HKCTU, that one has dissolved.
I see. Yes. Yeah.
The one that they call Zhigongmao.
Yes.
Yeah.
After 2020, yes.
Yeah.
In a wave of attack on Fujian.
Right, I think probably one last question.
Sure, thank you. So when you were discussing the local effects, you mentioned that Taiwan's Green Party tried to translate the International Green Party's charter into the local context. But then the example you gave was an unsuccessful one, regarding the abolition of the death penalty. So I wonder if there are cases where the Green Party was more successful in pushing forward the charter, because even the legalization of same-sex marriage in Taiwan, I felt, was more propelled by the by the DPP rather than the Green Party. And I think this comparison between the death penalty and same-sex marriage is meaningful because one succeeded. The one on legalization of same-sex marriage succeeded while the abolition of death penalty failed. So what makes this difference? And because your argument is that it's more about international self-representation as a progressive nation state, but then not all of them succeeded. And the second, I have a very short second question. Most generally, I felt that the Green Party in Taiwan doesn't have a celebrity politician, because if you compare it with other young but minor parties such as New Power Party and Taiwan People's Party, they all have their own recognizable faces. But does the Green Party deliberately avoid coming up with their own celebrity politicians, or what do the other international Green Parties do about this? Thank you.
Yeah, some really good questions there. Clearly, there's. I mean, the closest the parties had to a celebrity was Pan Heng-seng, and his style was definitely not something that some figures in the party were comfortable with. I think that's probably a mistake. I think you do need to have name recognition in Taiwanese elections, and that was why they had quite a very strong campaign in 2020 with the kind of media mainstream feminist Deng Hui-wen, who I think really won them a lot of votes. but yeah, there's definitely resistance to that. An example was Wang Haoyu, who was a kind of internet celebrity who was tended to be very politically incorrect, and he liked conflict, and he brought a lot of internet visibility to the party, but also damaged the party's reputation. But I think nowadays the party's just too quiet. You need a bit more visibility. It's just a kind of politically correct visibility. And I think if we think about the comparative cases that you mentioned, there you can partly see, and I think Kuomintang does make that argument about the New Power Party's success in 2016, that it did have those well-known figures who could bring in the vote, who were young, good-looking, and maybe that the Green Party should kind of, I think, needs to look at that. I mean, I would argue that on the LGBT issue, that even though the DUP was moving towards that issue in the early 2000s, it wasn't really doing openly to the Taiwanese political market. For example, when there were LGBT activists coming from the US, they would issue an international press release, but they were quite quiet domestically. And I remember they got criticized for that. So I would argue that it's more that they were following civil society on that issue. Once they realized that public opinion has shifted, particularly in the aftermath of the sunflower movement. And I think the death penalty one is definitely one where public opinion is just too hard to move there. Probably if it's lifted, I think public opinion is going to move, shift position, as it did with same-sex marriage. But you just need someone with that courage to deal with it. I think another area where there's been success has been on nuclear power. And the DP has been quite wavering on that issue. And because one question that I'm sometimes asked on this project is, why does Taiwan's environmental movement, why is it so much more successful than the Green Party? If we compare to the UK, where we're moving to a new generation of nuclear power stations, it's unimaginable in Taiwan. Well, I think it's unimaginable in Taiwan, particularly post-referendum. But I think the Green Party figures would say that we're just part of that movement. There's no dividing line between us and the actual civil society. And people move back and forth all the time. So I would see that as a real, really remarkable success, that they never gave up on opposition to nuclear power and were able to kind of push the mainstream parties. And talking to people, they do say, we want to change the DPP. We want to stay outside. A little bit like the New Party tries to change the KMT. It's kind of a similar kind of way of thinking.
On that last point, actually, that sparks another question. Do you think that the Green Party is especially successful at pushing the mainstream parties, in particular the DPP? Because I think a lot of people would point to the Xindang pressure on the KMT and say, well, that wasn't really very successful. In fact, maybe quite the opposite, right? You see the KMT sort of moving away from the positions that the new party is trying to push them towards during much of that period. So is the Green Party particularly successful, or am I misinterpreting the new party and its success or lack thereof?
I think it really depends on which period we're looking at.
Yes.
Under Li Donghui, the new party, the KMT is moving in the opposite direction. But after Li leaves the party, I would say that essentially what we have in the Mainzhou era is a blueprint that the new party has set up in the 1990s. They are quite influential in terms of advisors, and that's why Mainzhou is able to bring people back, because so many people leave the KMT under Li, but actually a lot of them come back. in 05, 06, 07. So in recent years, they've been wavering. And that's part of the reason why the new party still exists, while some of the other splinter parties have disappeared, because at least it has a position. Under someone like Hong Xiu-zhu, for example, the two were very close. Under Zhu Lilun, there's a bit of distance there. But if, what's his name, Zhang Yaozhong had won that primary for KMT leadership, there'd be not too much difference.
But is the Green Party especially successful, do you think, in pushing the DPP?
To a certain extent. If we think about the Green Party as part of the environmental movement, then I would say it is.
Or LGBT rights, for example? Or,
yes,
or
and I think one of the reasons for that is the way that the DPP has tried to poach people from the Green Party. Right. So if we look at the 2016 election, you have 2 ex-Green Party leaders nominated by the DPP for Parliament, and then 2 more former members. In 2020, you've got a former party member nominated for DPP and the former leader of the Social Democratic Party. So they basically destroy that party through nomination. And that is, I think, one of the reasons, and again, He Ming-chiu makes that argument, that the nature of the DPP has changed after 2016. The social movement side of the party is much stronger on that party list. And I think that's one of the things that makes the DPP a little bit more progressive than it had been, let's say, under Chen.
Great. So thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Professor David Fell, for a fantastic talk and very stimulating discussion. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for fantastic questions.